Hi, everyone. So I'm glad to be here today to tell you about some of my research related to auto-deleveraging, and specifically this new idea of risk-based auto-deleveraging. So just to start with, what is auto-deleveraging and why should you care? Well, the idea here is that imagine you have a trader who's long, prices go down. At some point, that trader becomes under-collateralized, and those positions need to be unwound. And there's typically a waterfall for unwinding those positions. So the best case is the first step here, which is that you unwind those positions by selling them into the order book. And everybody's happy. However, sometimes when in times of more duress, that's not possible. So maybe the next step is some type of backstop or insurance fund, something like the HLV pool. But in times of extreme stress, that's not possible either. And the end of the waterfall is what we call auto-deleveraging. And the idea here is if you must unwind an under-collateralized position and there's no buyer of that position on the other side, auto-deleveraging finds someone on the other side to forcibly close that position. So on the one hand, this is undesirable, right? If you're on the other side and you've made a profitable trade and, what ADL can do is it can take your position away potentially at the worst possible time when things are, illiquid, when it's hard to re-enter that position and so on. However, ultimately, it's necessary because if you don't unwind that position, if you don't have a mechanism like auto-deleveraging, the exchange can potentially suffer unbounded losses, and those losses will ultimately be transmitted to the end users, right? So while it's not pleasant, auto-deleveraging is necessary, and the research question here is how do we do it as best as possible? And this is not a theoretical concern. As probably you've all heard about, on October 10th, there was a flash crash, which resulted in a massive auto-deleveraging across a number of futures exchanges, including, for example, $2 billion on Hyperliquid. And so this is not a theoretical concern. This is something that actually happens. Now, what is the status quo in auto-deleveraging? Basically, almost every exchange, including Binance, including Hyperliquid, and so on, works on this queue-based auto-deleveraging mechanism, which was initially introduced by BitMEX. And the idea of queue-based auto-deleveraging is that you take your accounts. Again, imagine we have a long position that needs to be unwound. We're going to find someone on the short side to unwind that against. What we're going to do is we're going to sort the short positions according to a priority ranking. This priority ranking be some combination of P&L and leverage. And then we're going to move through that priority ordering one at a time, unwinding short positions until the requisite quantity is unwound. Now, what's the issue with this? It turns out there's a number of issues. The first and foremost issue is that it's largely entirely ad hoc, right? Like, why this rule? Why the combination of P&L and leverage? Well, at a high level, it might seem reasonable, but this was sort of proposed by BitMEX and to some extent copy-pasted by everyone else. It doesn't derive from any kind of higher level principle or objective. So that's kind of one objective, but beyond that, it's gameable. For example, the existing system is not Sybil resistant. You can take a position that's in one account and split it into two accounts and do that in a way which will try to avoid auto-deleveraging. Similarly, it's not wash trade resistant. The second and auto-deleveraging rule looks at unrealized P&L. Well, that's something that can be manipulated. If you can do a wash trade, you can transfer unrealized P&L to margin, and again, you can avoid auto-deleveraging. And it has other bad properties. So, for example, it is not path independent. If I apply auto-deleveraging twice versus applying it once on the total quantity, the outcomes aren't the same. And so it's not robust to sort of minor changes in timing and things like that. So what we propose to do in this research is to do something in a better way, in a principled way. And the core idea is if auto-deleveraging is about risk management, is about reducing the risk to the exchange and ultimately reducing the downstream risk to end users, then ADL should come at it from a perspective of minimizing the risk of future exchange losses. And what are those future exchange losses? Well, the future exchange losses are the chance that one of the remaining accounts later goes insolvent. right? So that's the perspective we're going to take. How can we do auto-deleveraging in a way that minimizes the future risk to the exchange? And the key insight here is that leverage is all you need. If you want to try to understand the risk that an account poses to an exchange, the main variable is leverage, the ratio of the position size, notional position size to the account equity. And the key property of leverage is this property on the right, which is that 1 over the leverage, that's kind of the percentage price change that will lead an account to go into to bankruptcy, right? And that's something that's already probably quite intuitive. For example, if you're 1x levered, well, to be bankrupt, you need 100% price move. But if you become 10x levered, only a 10% price move can bankrupt you. At 100x levered, even a 1% a move can bankrupt you. So now going back to the perspective of an exchange's auto-deleveraging decision, the key idea is if you want to auto-delever in a way that's going to minimize your future risk of equity shortfalls, then you have to focus on the accounts that are closest to insolvency, and that is going to be the most highly leveraged accounts. And in a way that we can, very kind of precisely quantify, if you're looking to say auto-delever one contract on the margin, you get the greatest benefit in terms of risk reduction by auto-delevering the highest leverage account on the exchange. And so what ultimately that suggests is a rule that we call water filling on leverage. The idea here is that if you want to ADL in a way that is going to minimize your future risk, what you should do is you should ADL in a way that reduces the leverage of the most highly levered accounts on the exchange. In other words, a minimax objective on leverage. And the way that would work is something as follows. Let's say here I have 4 accounts. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sort the accounts by leverage. So here maybe account 1 is the highest leverage, followed by account 2, followed by account 3, and so on. And as I need to auto-delever, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by auto-delevering the highest leverage account. Once that ties with the second highest leverage account, I auto-delever them both in parallel. And here it ties to the third, and so on. And I continue until ultimately I've recovered the full amount that I need. What we're able to show is that this is optimal from a risk perspective, in the sense that no other ADL allocation will do better. To contrast that with what's done in practice, the BitMEX style rule, it differs in 2 ways. First of all, they're similar. They're similar in that they both have a priority metric, right? But one difference is that we focus exclusively on leverage, while the BitMEX rule focuses on a combination of leverage and P&L. The second difference, though, is that rather than proceeding sequentially, account by account, we proceed in parallel, draining all the most highly levered accounts at the same time. But I think the nice thing about this here is the rule is sufficiently close to actually what's done in practice that it presumably wouldn't be as such a big lift to switch from a BitMEX type rule to a leverage draining type of rule. Now, aside from being optimal from a risk perspective, this has a number of other properties. All the ways that the existing BitMEX rule is gameable, this is not. So for example, you cannot reduce your leverage by splitting into sub-accounts. If you split into sub-accounts and one has lower leverage, then necessarily another one will have higher leverage and will, in fact, be ADL'd further. Similarly, there's no way to game this through wash trading, right? You can't reduce your leverage by wash trading. It's path independent. If you ADL 2 small quantities in sequence, that's the same as ADLing the aggregate quantity. And finally, it is principled. The core principle here is to reduce risk of the exchange. Now, there's one kind of wrinkle here, which is that everything I've told you really applies to an isolated margin setting when you're trading a single asset. When you're in a cross-margin setting and you have multiple different contracts, the story is a bit more complicated in that raw leverage isn't enough because, for example, you may have a very highly levered account like account 4 over here, but if it's balanced long versus short, that account might not actually be contributing that much risk. And if you delever it, you're breaking the hedge and you may actually be increasing the risk. risk. So we have a modification of the rule where rather than just looking at just looking at gross leverage, you look at a factor leverage. And the idea of factor leverage is how much leverage do you have on the dominant market factor. And this is a type of leverage measure that will actually incorporate things like correlations and hedging between different positions and so on. So just to give a quick numerical example, we went through some of the ADLs that happened on October 10th, and we looked at 4 different methods in terms of the share of risk that they reduce on the exchange. The baseline is what actually happened, what Hyperliquid did, which reduced the exchange risk by 35% of the total achievable. If you do just the leverage water filling I described, you get to about 70%. And if you do the cross margin aware, where you take you look at the factor-based leverage, you get to about 90%. So that's basically the idea. The core idea here is that ADL is quite important. It should be come at it from a risk perspective, and there are simple modifications of the existing rules, namely switching from a sequential, priority-based procedure to a leverage a water filling type of procedure that can do much better than what is there today. Thank you.